Welcome to KU Padasala. I'm Dr. Sarita ji. In this segment, I hope to cover the second module from the core course British Literature 1 in the syllabus of third semester BA English Language and Literature. The title of this module is Elizabethan Age. As I mentioned in the previous segment, I will not be discussing the text prescribed for study, but will give a general overview of these topics. Gorbuduc, Ralph Royster Doyster, Total's Miscellany, University Wits, and so on. Continuing from the evolution of drama in different stages, we now come to the fourth stage. We'll take a quick recap of the previous stages, starting with the first stage, which was marked by the performance of gospel stories in churches. They were called miracle or mystery plays. The second stage was when the plays moved out of the churches to marketplaces. Guilds were entrusted with their performance. This was in the 14th century. Laymen also began to act in them. In the third stage, mystery and miracle plays gave place to the morality and interludes, and they continued to flourish till Queen Elizabeth's reign. A careful survey of the lines of development shown by drama down to the age of Queen Elizabeth leaves us with the impression of all these stages, the four stages, before early plays gradually merged with Elizabethan drama. However, it may be said without any doubt that the history of English drama is rooted in lay as well as in religious history. The fourth stage sees the beginning of English tragedy, for tragedy preceded comedy in England as it did in Greece. Seneca's tragedies, with their earnest and strenuous atmosphere, inspired the writers of the day. Gorbuduc, the first English drama, was first named Ferrex and Perex. The play was written by Thomas Norton and Thomas Sackville, and it was performed before Queen Elizabeth at Whitehall. A gory play, Gorbuduc is known as the first formal tragedy in English, even though it hardly meets the standards of the genre in tone, characterization, or theme. Written in blank verse, Gorbuduc tells the story of a mythical king of ancient Britain. Of more importance in this period was the development of English comedy as exemplified by Ralph Royster Doyster and Gamma Gurton's Needle. These plays are rich in English humor. The first one, that is Ralph Royster Doyster, shows a keen sense of dramatic movement. It is attributed to Nicholas Udall, the headmaster of Eton, and it is based on a careful study of Plautus. The classical form has absorbed elements belonging to both morality and interlude. The play is also marked by the title Comedy or Interlude. Nicholas Udall is justly entitled to be called the father of English comedy. But in all these plays, you don't really see any real vitality or power. And it was a new school called the University Wits who seriously brought in that literary grace into the genre. University Wits, they were a notable group of pioneer English dramatists who wrote during the last 15 years of the 16th century. It was the University Wits who transformed the native interlude and chronicle play with their plays of quality and diversity. The University Wits come under the first dramatic period of the Elizabethan Age. In fact, the term was first used by George Sainsbury in his book, A History of the Elizabethan Literature. The University Wits are the generation educated at Oxford or Cambridge universities. They used their poetry to make theatre. They breathed new life into traditional models, classical models, and they also brought a new audience to the issues and conflicts which the stage could dramatize. They liberated English tragedy from the restrictions of the actual life. The university wits include Christopher Marlowe, Robert Greene, and Thomas Nash. They were all graduates from Cambridge. And the group also included Thomas Lodge and George Peele. Both of them were graduates from the Oxford University. Another of the university wits, even though he was not university trained, was Thomas Kidd. The university wits paved the way for William Shakespeare. Christopher Marlowe, the greatest poetic dramatist among the university wits, was undoubtedly Christopher Marlowe. His handling of blank verse gave the theatre its characteristic voice for the next 50 years. The university wits are considered the first real fashioners and predecessors of Elizabethan drama, and of them Christopher Marlowe was immeasurably the greatest. Marlowe is the central sun, and around him revolved as minor stars Lilly, Greene, Peele, Nash, and Lodge. The advent of this morning star of English drama marks the end of medieval drama and the birth of the great Renaissance drama. Instead of making drama a vehicle for moral lessons, Christopher Marlowe raised it to a higher level by giving it a poetic grandeur. Marlowe's most important contribution was the establishment of the blank verse as the fitting meter for English poetic tragedy. He glorified the matter of a stage by his sweep of imagination. He vitalized drama by his energizing power and characterization. He was able to fathom the immense possibilities of the blank verse and how it could be made the expression of the finest wit and the most delicate fancy. Edward II, a tragedy in blank verse written by Marlowe, stands apart as a new experiment in Marlowean drama based on English history. It is culled from Holinshed's Chronicles. Edward II has an important place in literary history as the first successful attempt we have at the interpretation of history on stage. Dr. Faustus. The full title of the play is The Tragical History of the Life and Death of Dr. Faustus. It is a tragedy in 5 acts published in 1604, but it was performed a decade or so earlier. In Dr. Faustus, Christopher Marlowe tells the story of Faust, the doctor turned necromancer who makes a pact with the devil in order to obtain knowledge and power. Both Dr. Faustus and Mephistopheles, who is the devil's intermediary in the play, are very powerfully portrayed. Marlowe examines Dr. Faustus's grandiose intellectual ambitions, revealing them as futile, self-destructive, and absurd. It is fair to say that Dr. Faustus represents the quintessential Renaissance man, and it is his thirst for knowledge that drives him into this contract with Mephistopheles. The appearance of Helen of Troy not only represents the fall from high-minded intellectualism, but also the seduction of the classical pagan world. Faustus's desire to return to the ancient world is represented by not only Helen, the most beautiful woman that the ancient world had produced, but also by the presence of the classical scholars. It was Christopher Marlowe who made drama such a great force in English literature. Thomas Kidd also deserves mention in this context for his adherence to the Senecan school and also for popularizing the blood and thunder element that proved one of the most attractive features of pre-Elizabethan drama. Thomas Kidd's Spanish tragedy continued the Senecan tradition, but with more sophistication than Gorboduc. Total's Miscellany, it is songs and sonnets that is more popularly known as Total's Miscellany. It is the best known and most admired anthology. Although it was not the first printed anthology of lyrics by several authors, Total's Miscellany is the most significant one. The beginning of modern English verse may be said to date from its publication in 1557. It is described as a collection of songs and sonnets, but it was not intended as a songbook. It is more of a book of verse. The anthology helped to establish a vernacular lyric tradition in print and provided a model for subsequent anthologizers. Total's Miscellany helped to establish a vernacular lyric tradition in print, and it provided a model for subsequent anthologies. The first edition came on 5th June 1557 with the title Songs and Sonnets. The volume consisted of 271 poems. It was the first of the poetic anthologies that became popular by the end of the 16th century. It is considered to be Total's greatest contribution to English literature. And it was also the last large use of sonnet form for several decades in printed work until the appearance of Philip Sidney's sonnet sequence Astrophel and Stella, and also the anthology The Phoenix Nest. The collection comprises mostly the works of Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, and Thomas Wyatt the Elder. Both of them were heavily influenced by Italian poetry. The star poet of Total's Miscellany was undoubtedly the Earl of Surrey. He created the English sonnet, the form of the English sonnet, by modifying the Petrarchan sonnet. So even though the English sonnet is called the Shakespearean sonnet, the name was attributed to Shakespeare mainly because of his fame, but it was actually created by the Earl of Surrey, and the form which Surrey created has 3 quatrains in alternate rhyme and also a concluding couplet. So it was easier to write in English than the Petrarchan form with its more complex rhyme scheme. Part of the Miscellany's significance was due to its role in popularizing the sonnet. The other poets represented in the Miscellany include Nicholas Grimald, a humanist scholar at Christ Church, Oxford. His poems are gathered together towards the end of the volume. We will also discuss a few other writers who have enriched Elizabethan writing through their valuable contributions. We start with Sir Philip Sidney. He was a courtier, a scholar, a poet, and a soldier, a true Renaissance man. He was not as bright as Marlowe or Lilly or Spencer, but he has produced a body of work which, for its versatile excellence, places him in the foremost rank of his time. He was a favorite in the court of Queen Elizabeth I. Sidney wrote the first great sonnet sequence in English, Astrophel and Stella. Before Sidney, Wyatt and others, Sir Thomas Wyatt and others had written excellent sonnets, but Sidney's sonnet series was the first linked by subject matter and theme. Each sonnet addresses an aspect of Astrophel's love for Stella. The sonnet series was inspired by Penelope Devereux, to whom Sir Philip Sidney had been engaged. Edmund Spencer represents the spirit of the age completely and comprehensively. He was truly the child of Renaissance and Reformation because of the fusion of the multiplex of ideas of both the movements in his work. In fact, he has all the striking features of Renaissance: beauty, splendor, sensuousness, charm, the interspersed moral control, the inward and heavenly beauty and love, the sprinkling of moral lacquer on all that is enticing to sensual eyes. They are all drawn from Reformation. His works strike that golden mean between the two movements, and it becomes difficult for the reader to label his works either as a product of Renaissance or Reformation. He has been called the Prince of Poets in his time. In fact, that is how he has been described in the monument set up by Lady Anne Clifford. He has inspired many of the later poets, the younger poets, even Milton and Keats. The greatest work of Spencer is The Faerie Queene. It has been called the epic of the English wars in Ireland under Elizabeth. The poem sets out to be a story with 12 knights of Queen Elizabeth. They undertake various enterprises in her honor. It is a beautiful mosaic into which are woven deeds of chivalry and pictorial fantasies and grave moralizing also. By Faerie Queene, the poem signifies glory in the abstract and Queen Elizabeth in particular. The Queen figures in the work as Britomart, Belphoebe, Glorians and Mercilla. Faerie Queene is an allegorical manifestation of the spirit of the age, the defense of Protestantism and also the glorification of Queen Elizabeth. Each of the 12 knights represents a virtue, and the adventures project symbolically the experiences, the conflicts and the temptations of the virtues in the turmoil of the world. And ultimately these virtues, they triumph with the aid of Prince Arthur, who is the very incarnation of divine power. Edmund Spencer has also invented the Spenserian stanza, a fixed verse form for his epic The Faerie Queene. Each stanza contains 9 lines in total, 8 lines in iambic pentameter, followed by a single Alexandrine line in iambic hexameter. The rhyme scheme is AB, AB, BC, BC, C. The Spenserian sonnet is a sonnet form named after Edmund Spencer. In fact, it was Spencer who created this sonnet form. It is somewhat like the English Shakespearean sonnet in that it comprises 3 quatrains and a rhyming couplet, but they are interlocked quatrains. The rhyme scheme is AB, AB, BC, BC, CD, CD and EE. His sonnet sequence, Amority, is addressed to the poet's own wife and not some idealized beauty. Isabella Whitney is important as the first English woman to have a volume of her poems published. She was the first female poet and professional woman writer in England. She is also credited with being the first English woman to have penned and published original secular poetry under her own name. Her first publication, entitled The Copy of a Letter, is on love and also the infidelity in love. It appeared in 1567. Her second published poetic work is titled A Sweet Nosegay or Pleasant Posy, containing 110 philosophical flowers. The volume appeared in 1573. The poems act as a retelling of Whitney's life. They are largely autobiographical. Sweet Nosegay, published in 1573, in this poem, she disrupts traditional associations of smell with women and domestic work. She goes on to emphasize her material presence, the dangers that surround her, ultimately anticipating the smell of her decaying corpse. She uses cultural associations with olfaction to style herself as a woman writer and also to lament the fact that she cannot support herself through her labor. Mary Sidney Herbert, the first English woman to achieve a significant literary reputation, is the sister of Sir Philip Sidney. She is celebrated for her patronage, her translations, and for her original poems praising Queen Elizabeth and her brother. Philip Sidney had dedicated his work Arcadia to this sister of his. After Philip Sidney's death, she published Arcadia and also completed his verse translation of the Psalms. She was devoted to literature and to creating great works in the English language. So that is important, because English was not considered a significant language at that time, because all the great works were written in Latin, in Italian or French, Latin, Greek, but very few were written in English. and English was not even spoken anywhere else in the world, rarely even in Scotland, Wales or Ireland. So pushing the boundaries of what was acceptable for women, she became the first woman to publish a play in English, and she was also the first woman to publish original dramatic verse. She was also the first woman who did not apologize for publishing her work. Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon, the English philosopher, statesman and essayist, was one of the most interesting figures of the age of Reformation and the revival of learning. He put an end to the prolixity and diffuseness in English prose. He is one of the greatest masters in the art of life. His work, essays, religious meditations, places of persuasion and dissuasion, seen and loved, was the first published book by Francis Bacon. It was published in 1597. Another work under the title Essays and Counsels, Civil and Moral, was published in 1625 with 58 essays. It is a collection of reflections and generalizations and abstracts from previous authors. They were all woven together into counsel for the successful conduct of life and management of man. These essays, they initially started as assemblages of aphorisms held together by a common subject. They constitute a handbook of practical wisdom, enclosed in very short maxims, an astonishing treasure of insight. They are a compendium of precepts which are true for all time, of all men and all places. Bacon's essays deal with comparatively few subjects concerning moral thought. The treatment is more scientific than that of the classical writers. He maintains an air of high seriousness and cold objectivity. He is unequaled in clarity, brevity, and lucidity of prose. His vocabulary is extremely rich, and he draws upon different whole fields of studies, literary and scientific. He was well read in the Bible and medieval philosophy. He uses Latinisms in his work. He also uses Saxon words and employs quotations generously. But then he gives more the substance than the exact verbal text, because he often quoted from memory. He maintains a grand style. Each essay is a string of detached reflections and maxims upon the same subject. Paragraphing was not important for him, and his writing is free from affectations, pedantry and vulgarity, and there is no display of feeling. However, his style made a powerful impact on the reader's mind. Brevity is never purchased at the expense of clarity. His essays reveal his philosophy or the Renaissance spirit. The essays deal mostly with public life and public affairs, but occasionally touches on other subjects like truth, marriage, love, friendship, studies, and so on. Alexander Pope, in his essay on man, refers to Sir Francis Bacon as the wisest, the brightest, and the meanest of mankind. Ben Jonson, in his drama, he is first and foremost a moralist and afterwards the artist. He was a writer of masques. Masks are a form of courtly entertainment that involved music and dancing within an elaborate stage design. His unfinished pastoral, The Sad Shepherd, is another beautiful poem. Ben Jonson wrote satires. In his drama, he preferred to poke fun at contemporary character types, particularly the plays Volpone and The Alchemist. A discussion on Ben Jonson would be incomplete without the famous comedy of humors, a dramatic genre most closely associated with Ben Jonson. The term comedy of humor derives from the Latin humor, meaning liquid, and its use in the medieval and Renaissance medical theory that a human body held a balance of 4 liquids or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile. In his play, Every Man Out of His Humor, Johnson explains that the system of humors governing the body. Johnson's characters usually represent one humor and thus unbalanced are basically caricatures. His consistent strength is the clear and direct expression of ideas. But he was too intent on proving some moral hypothesis, and even though his satire is very much admirable, he often compromised the artist for the moralist. Such was, oh, rare Ben Jonson. So this is the simple epitaph. Literature has probably never had a more determined and passionate disciple than Ben Jonson. We now come to metaphysical poetry. Two forces opposed each other in the 17th century England. They opposed each other over a range of cultural, political and religious issues. One group, that is the members of royalty, or the group that was more sympathetic towards the monarch, supported the reign of Charles I. The other group consisted of deeply religious people who were mostly middle class and sympathetic to a Puritan form of Protestantism. Most of them, not all, most of the 17th century English poets wrote from the perspective of one of these two groups. The Cavalier poets was a school of English poets of the 17th century that supported Charles I during the Civil War. They came to be known as the Cavalier, the royalists came to be called the Cavalier poets, and the religious poets came to be called the metaphysical poets. The metaphysical poets were all influenced by the Elizabethans, Shakespeare among them, even though Shakespeare's preeminence among Elizabethans was not assured in the 17th century. The term metaphysical covers two different kinds of poets. One, witty, analytic and frank. Second, earnest and devout. Johnson's famous description of the characteristics of metaphysical poetry in his work Life of Cowley was the first systematic attempt to define their quality. It is the intellectual stimulus that makes the love poetry and the devotional poetry of the metaphysical poets so rich and interesting. The metaphysical poets are contemporary in tone and tenor, yet they are different from and superior to the modernist poetry with vulgar indecencies of thought, imagery, feeling and telegraphic diction. The metaphysical meditations are brief, compellingly unpretentious and intense, like God and God's relation to man. The other characteristics of metaphysical poetry, we might mention the spirituality and religious experience with their emphasis on man's relationship with God, morality and shared humanity. Metaphysical conceit that employs extended metaphor and elaborate wordplay is another feature. Irregularity of versification scheme, the abrupt tonal shifts, the argumentative ending, the elaborate use of metaphor, they all characterize metaphysical poetry. So we now come to the last topic in this module, John Donne. John Donne is the founder of the school of metaphysical poets. He had no interest in the beauties of nature like the other poets. The king that ruled the universal monarchy of wit. That is how he has been described. But he was ignored in the 18th and 19th centuries. But later his popularity was restored during the First World War. It is possible to identify two distinguishable parts of Donne's works, the amorous and the religious. Amorous or love poetry. A peculiar appeal of his amorous poetry is the positive charm, and his religious sonnets reveal the depth of philosophy, subtlety of reasoning, a blend of thought and devotion, and also the mingling of the ordinary and the sublime. Both amorous and religious poetry have spontaneity of diction. Dunn's poetry reflects the shifting sensibilities of the age. It abounds in unpoetic sort of imagery like telescope, geometrical instruments, printing machines, and the paraphernalia of the Renaissance laboratory. The metaphysical features that appear in his poems include conceit or the use of far-fetched comparisons, lack of feeling, use of paradox, sustained dialectic, novelty, incongruity, muscular rhythms. They all give the effect of a speaking voice, and the diction that he uses is more colloquial and modern. His poems are dramatic or argumentative. They are impassioned or intellectual. All of these are manifestations of tributes to his formidable wit. With that, we come to the end of the discussion. I hope I was able to throw some light on the topics included in the second module. Thank you so much.